Okay, I'm going to officially welcome you all to this webinar, Fossil Fuels as Roadblocks to Peace and Why the Fossil Fuel Treaty is Key to Peace and Climate Justice. And this webinar is co-hosted by WILPF and the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. I'm Katrin Geyer. I am the Environment Advisor at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is the world's oldest feminist peace organization, and we're also a partner of the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. And I'm really, really happy to see so many of you here. And mostly, I'm very happy to have brought together this amazing panel of wonderful speakers who will be sharing their unique analysis and perspectives on the intersections of fossil fuels, conflict, and structural violence from a feminist perspective. But before we dive into all of that, the usual housekeeping, and we'll start with interpretation. So I want to hand it over to Talis to briefly explain how you can access interpretation that we have today available in Spanish. Talis?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias. Hola, yo soy Talis. Estoy aquí con mi cointérprete Ron. Venimos representando a Tilde, la Cooperativa de Justicia del Lenguaje, y vamos a ser sus intérpretes el día de hoy, interpretando todo del inglés al español y del español al inglés, utilizando la función de interpretación simultánea de Zoom. Hi everyone, my name is Talis. I'm here with my co-interpreter Ron. We're here representing Tilde Language Justice Co-op. We are going to be your Spanish English interpreters today. We're going to be interpreting everything from English into Spanish and from Spanish into English using the Zoom simultaneous interpretation feature that I will explain how to use in a moment. Para acceder a la interpretación, para todas las personas que o no sean completamente bilingües en inglés y en español, o que simplemente prefieran escuchar solamente en español, si prefieren solo escuchar y participar en español, si están aquí a través de una computadora, pueden hacer clic en un globito, como ven en su pantalla, un globito en la parte inferior en medio de su pantalla de Zoom. Ahí pueden hacer clic y seleccionar el canal de español. Si no están viendo ese globito o si están aquí a través de una tableta o teléfono inteligente, entonces pueden hacer clic en los tres puntitos en la parte inferior derecha que dicen más. Ahí van a poder seleccionar interpretación de idiomas y de nuevo ahí pueden seleccionar el canal de español. So to access interpretation, and this is going to be for everyone who is not completely bilingual in English and Spanish, if you're not quite fluent in Spanish or not fluent at all in Spanish, you're going to want to join the English channel because part of the session today will be in Spanish, and you want to be able to understand what's being said through the interpretation. So you can join the English channel if you're here via a computer. There should be a little globe at the bottom center of your Zoom screen that says interpretation. You can click that globe, and there you can join the English channel. If you don't see that globe or you're here through a smartphone or a tablet, then you can click on the three little dots at the bottom right corner of your Zoom app, the three dots that say more. Click that and there select language interpretation. And once again, you can join the English channel there. Les recordamos a los oradores, por favor, hablar a un ritmo moderado, un poquito más lento, tomando pausas, respirando para que podamos seguirles e interpretar su mensaje completo. We kindly remind speakers to please speak at a moderate pace, taking pauses, taking breaths, so that we're able to follow along and interpret your full message. Por último, si hay algún problema con la interpretación, por favor díganos a través del chat y les ayudaremos en cuanto podamos. Lastly, if there are any issues with interpretation, please let us know through the chat and we will help you out as soon as we can. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Talis. All right, next slide, please. So we have allocated 90 minutes for this webinar, but we might not need all of this time. So let's see how we go. And you can use the chat to introduce yourself. You can also share comments in the chat, but if you have specific questions for the panelists, then please put those in the Q&A function, and we'll get back to those in the Q&A segment. So I will be taking now a few minutes to set a little bit of the context for today's session before we'll hear from our panelists Ayshka, Beatrice, Mitzi, and Natalia. Next slide, please. So this webinar is taking place in support of the Global Week of Action for Peace and Climate Justice, as well as the Global Draw the Line campaign. And both of these campaigns bring together really diverse movements and issues, but they are centered around climate justice. And then we also have, we will be commemorating the International Day of Peace this Sunday, 21st of September. And so it is for all of these reasons that we're hosting this webinar today, a webinar that is seeking to bridge the issues of the climate crisis, militarism and conflict, and extractivism, and wanting to shed light on how all of these issues are sustained by systems of oppression from patriarchy to capitalism. Um, but in the webinar today, we don't just want to talk about the problems and the challenges. We also want to surface and spotlight one specific initiative that is currently gaining immense momentum. It's accelerating speed. It is sustained by a truly global and intersectional movement, and that really is a true glimmer of hope amidst hypermilitarization, ecological disasters, and increased geopolitical fragmentation and division. And that is the Fossil Fuel Treaty. Um, we will dive into what the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative exactly is later in the webinar, but just to say for now that the proposal for a fossil fuel treaty really has the potential to become a climate tool for peace because it seeks to explicitly address the supply side of fossil fuels, and it seeks to promote international cooperation toward a global just transition. And so the proposal for fossil fuel treaty would stop the expansion of fossil fuels, and it would coordinate the phase out of fossil fuels. And this process is currently spearheaded by 17 countries, but it is also really carried and propelled forward by a truly global and intersectional civil society movement. But we'll talk about all of that more later in this webinar. Um, so before we hear from our panelists, who will provide unique perspectives from their context, from the Philippines to Spain, from Colombia to the Middle East, I wanted to start us off with sharing a bit of a broader global reflections on why we need to talk about fossil fuels as peace activists and why we need to talk about militarism and conflict as climate justice activists. So they're currently, if you are part of the climate justice movement, you might have seen it. There's a lot of talk right now about how the just transition away from fossil fuels is to be financed. The issue of the just transition will be one of the key themes discussed at this year's UN Climate Change Conference in Belém at COP30, but it is also an essential pillar of the proposed fossil fuel treaty. And supporting countries, especially from the global south, to move away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner will require vast amounts of resources. And WILPF has been calling for the reallocation of military expenditure for decades. But I think that in this moment in time, the misallocation of resources really could not be more stark. We're seeing hypermilitarization, skyrocketing global military expenditure. So global military spending has risen for 10 consecutive years, and it reached an all-time high of $2.7 trillion in 2024. And this money is our public resources, right? This is taxpayers' money um, that these governments are spending on the military. And it's the same governments that say at the same time that there is no money for climate finance, nor for supporting the global south in a just and equitable transition. So there's a huge misallocation of resources to militarism instead of climate justice and the just transition. And I want to refer here to the most recent report by the UN Secretary General on military spending, which was published actually just a few days ago, where it is estimated that there is currently a shortfall of almost $2 trillion annually in meeting energy and climate related needs of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, in other words, 1 year of military spending would easily cover all of the costs required to meet energy and climate needs around the world, as the report suggests. Next slide, please. Another topic that I just briefly want to touch upon is, um, of course, also the issue of fossil fuel revenues funding continued aggression. And the most stark and most recent example of this is the ongoing war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has been propped up by over 937 billion euros in fossil fuel revenues since 2022, so the start of the invasion. And Global Witness calculated that just a tiny fraction of this amount are enough to buy 1,200 cruise missiles or 60,000 drones, all of which have been used to bomb cities and kill civilians across Ukraine. So we basically have a full cycle where revenues from fossil fuels fund war and militarism, which is powered by fossil fuels because missiles, fighter jets, and bombs, they all are powered by oil. Next slide, please. But it's not only during active conflict where we're seeing a huge increase of emissions. We also know that military activity during so-called peace times is also responsible for a huge amount of global emissions, and that is conservatively estimated to be at 5.5% of global emissions. And just to put that into perspective, the global civil aviation industry emits around 2.5%, so only half of that. And I want to quote, oh, sorry, and one thing I want to mention here as well is that we know that there's a positive correlation between an increase in military spending and an increase in emissions. So if military spending rises, we also know that emissions are rising. And I want to again quote here the UN Secretary General's report on military spending, as it's a quote that I think really drives home the immense obstacle that militarism plays in our struggle for climate justice. And so the report says that a recent study shows that due to the high carbon intensity of military-related production, even if the world otherwise converges on pathways consistent with the Paris Agreement on climate change, a substantial rise in military spending could render climate goals unattainable. So that is really incredibly significant, and we cannot ignore the role of militarism as climate justice activists. Um, Next slide. But I also think that at this moment in time, we really cannot speak about the intersections of climate justice and militarism without speaking about the ongoing devastating genocide in Gaza. And this is first and foremost an unspeakable human tragedy. And I don't think I need to tell anyone here how shameful the majority of governments have been in their inaction or complicity in this genocide. Um, but if we dig deeper, there are also really significant links between the genocide and our struggles for climate justice. And there's been now a few studies that have shown that have collected the additional emissions arising from the genocide in Palestine. And there's a most recent study that suggests that looks at the long-term climate cost of destroying, clearing, and rebuilding Gaza, which finds that the emissions could exceed the combined 2023 annual greenhouse gas emissions by Costa Rica and Estonia. And just yesterday, our colleagues at Tipping Point North South and the Palestinian Institute for Climate Strategy have published a new paper which assesses the long-term social and environmental damage of Israel's decade-long occupation. And it calculates the climate reparations that Israel owes to Palestinians. And that number is $103 billion. But of course, it's important to recognize that this number is just one entry point and the that no numbers will ever be enough to quantify the harm and the pain from the occupation, the genocide, and the ecocide of the bodies and the lands of Palestinians. Um, and one other issue that I want to mention here around intersections of genocide and climate justice is that thanks to the special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Palestine, Francesca Albanese's recent report From Economy of Occupation to Economy of Genocide, we also know that the same institutions and corporations that are wreaking havoc on the climate are actually also the very foundational forces that power this genocide. So these are asset management firms like BlackRock or financial institutions like Barclays, which channel billions of dollars into treasury bonds and companies that are directly involved in Israel's occupation and genocide. And we know that these same financial institutions and banks are also continuing to invest heavily in fossil fuel companies. And then we have, of course, the fossil fuel corporations themselves, such as BP or Chevron, which are key enablers of both the genocide and the climate crisis. So, according to Albanese's report, Chevron is paying millions of royalties and taxes each year to Israel for its extraction of natural gas from the Leviathan and Tamar fields, and BP is expanding its involvement in the Israeli economy with confirmed exploration licenses. Um, and of course, there's much, much more to be said on this topic, but these brief examples, I think, really demonstrate how the same sectors are complicit in genocide and the climate crisis. And it is really essential to bring these sectors into the spotlight as key enablers of both of an extractivist and militarized global economy. And now moving to my final point, that I just wanted to highlight here from a feminist perspective. Um, I think it's really important also to highlight the essential role that the fossil fuel industry plays in bolstering white patriarchal rule. And there's some amazing feminist scholars, such as Kara Daggett, who describes this relationship as petromasculinity, or Joni Sager, who speaks about petrobromance. But basically, they are referring to the way that fossil fuels are a way of making and sustaining masculine identities, and especially white conservative men's attachment to fossil fuels, um, because there's such an intimate connection between fossil fuels and the status quo, and the interest by this group of people to maintain the status quo because they benefit from it. And of course, we're seeing this with Trump currently as really the caricature of this phenomenon. And I think it's also important to mention that extractive industries like coal, oil, and gas are highly male dominated and masculinized. And so these male power structures mean that in these industries, it's predominantly men who benefit from these industries, and those that are disproportionately harmed are women and other marginalized communities. And this is something that I haven't touched upon and won't go more into detail. Because I know that my fellow panelists will address this in their contributions, but it really is, we also really need to look at the vast trail of documented harm and the structural and gendered violence that the fossil fuel industry is responsible for, um, from the Philippines to Mozambique and Colombia. So basically, men reap the benefits of this industry, while women and other marginalized communities bear the harm disproportionately. Okay, so now we will turn to our wonderful panelists, and we will start with Beatrice. Beatrice is a doctoral candidate at the University of Brighton and a member of the Center for Applied Philosophy, Politics, and Ethics. Her research explores the intersections between climate, energy, gender, and peace. Specifically, she focuses on the ecological, gender, and security dimensions of fossil fuel militarism. She's an intersectional feminist, environmentalist, and pacifist, and a member of WILPF Spain. Previously, she worked in settings of armed conflict and forced displacement in Kenya, Uganda, Palestine, Iraq, Morocco, Tunisia, Spain, and the Sahrawi refugee camps in southwest Algeria. Beatrice, you have undertaken really extensive research in which you explore the way that the fossil fuel industry perpetuates structural and gendered harm in specific contexts, including in Mozambique. And also, as a member of WILPF Spain, you've also explored Spain's current fossil fuel policies and how this connects to global contexts. And so I would love to hear from you about your main findings from your research. And you are joining us today from Mozambique. So would also love to know more about your contextual analysis from there. And hopefully the internet connection will hold up. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me and see me well? Okay. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all, depending on where you are today. Thank you so very much, Catherine, for inviting me to this feminist and pacifist space. I am deeply grateful and honored for being here with you today, especially for sharing this space with my colleagues whose work and contributions are so absolutely essential. As Catherine said, I am joining you today from northern Mozambique, from the port of Nacala. This is where my husband, his parents, his cousins, aunts, and uncles grew up. Now living in exile, in my husband's moments of saudade, of longing for motherland, he will remember when he was younger and used to go to Nacala Bay with his extensive family. They will play on a gorgeous sandy beach with crystal clear water, colorful marine life, and the most gorgeous sunsets. Today, Nacala Bay is no longer what my husband remembers. In just a few decades, the bay became rather a bay of death. Instead of sandy beaches with crystal clear water, petrol pollutes and darkens water and sand. They're no longer colorful fishes, but rather large, noisy, and dirty ships with international flags and the complicity of local authorities, which discharge their fuel in these waters, killing it all. Instead of a gorgeous sun setting on the bay, military bases. Today, we're gathering to acknowledge, share, and demand reparations for the harms inflicted on our bodies and our territories by the fossil fuel military industrial complex. I will present in Spanish for most of the time with the hope of challenging power dynamics in mostly English-dominated spaces. Como dijo Catherine, soy parte de WILPF España, también de WILPF Reino Unido. Precisamente en WILPF España llevamos a cabo una campaña en apoyo al Tratado de No Proliferación de Combustibles Fósiles durante el año 2023 y 2024. La campaña consistió en 4 líneas de acción. La primera, sensibilización interna y trabajo en red con otras delegaciones de WILPF, también trabajando en apoyo del tratado, con el fin de fortalecer el análisis de los vínculos entre crisis climática, militarismo, combustibles fósiles y paz feminista. La segunda línea de acción fue coordinación con organizaciones nacionales con el fin de unir sinergias entre los movimientos ecologistas, feministas, pacifistas y de derechos humanos. La tercera línea de acción fue sensibilización pública, con la celebración de un webinario con las contribuciones de académicas y lideresas sociales como Teresa Acuña desde Mozambique, Ivonne Yáñez desde Ecuador y Yubelis Morales desde Colombia. La cuarta y la última línea de acción fue incidencia política, para la cual realizamos un informe al que me voy a referir hoy, que divulgamos entre parlamentarios nacionales, eurodiputados y otros representantes políticos afines. Es con motivo de esta campaña que desde WILPF España hemos fortalecido y ampliado nuestra perspectiva feminista y pacifista a la producción de combustibles fósiles y su relación con los conflictos armados, las ocupaciones militares, el aumento del militarismo y de la violencia armada en general. Desde una perspectiva feminista y pacifista, ponemos la red de la vida en el centro y llamamos la atención sobre cómo el complejo militar y de producción de combustibles fósiles atenta contra la vida, destruye los ecosistemas, recrudece la crisis climática, violenta los cuerpos y los territorios y se asienta sobre estructuras de poder y privilegio como el patriarcado, el colonialismo, el racismo o el antropocentrismo. En nuestro informe denunciamos estos vínculos letales entre la producción de combustibles fósiles, la crisis climática y el militarismo, con impactos específicos de género interseccionales en el sur global y en las periferias del norte global, y también en la seguridad y la paz globales. No basta, por tanto, con reducir nuestro combustible de combustibles fósiles. No basta tampoco con demandar que los ejércitos informen de sus emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Necesitamos detener todos los proyectos de combustibles fósiles presentes y futuros y demandar la abolición de los ejércitos, las guerras y las ocupaciones militares y los vínculos neocoloniales. Y aún más importante que eso, demandamos responsabilidades históricas y que los que contaminan y destruyen la vida paguen. Como mencionaba Catherine, en el informe nos centramos también en el contexto español. Voy a intentar hablar un poquito más despacio para la interpretación. España ha hecho grandes avances en temas de política climática, pero todavía es altamente dependiente de los combustibles fósiles, sobre todo el gas fósil, que importa de terceros países, algunos con estándares de protección de derechos humanos y ambientales cuanto menos cuestionables. Además, España dedicó 24.000 millones de euros en subvenciones a los combustibles fósiles solamente en 2022, un 21% más que en 2021. Desde WILPF España pedimos al Gobierno del Estado español que muestre el liderazgo que ha mostrado en otros ámbitos de la política y cooperación internacionales y apoye el tratado para así convertirse en el primer Estado europeo con responsabilidades coloniales históricas y actuales en apoyar el tratado. Pedimos también que introduzca una visión feminista y pacifista en su política climática, doméstica e internacional, que integre los impactos de la crisis climática en la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad, que detenga los subsidios a los combustibles fósiles, que financie pérdidas y daños, que elimine la impunidad de la industria fosilista como Repsol y de los bancos y agencias de crédito como el Banco Santander, que las hacen posibles, y que aplique un gravamen a los ejércitos y las grandes fortunas que contaminan y destruyen la vida. En nuestro informe nos hemos centrado en tres casos de estudio, como comentaba, Colombia, Ecuador y Mozambique. Permitidme que, ya que estoy aquí en Mozambique ahora, vuelva a la tierra de mi familia política, Mozambique, donde ahora me encuentro. Mozambique ocupa el puesto 30 en el ranking de países más biodiversos del mundo. Hasta el 2022, Mozambique había contribuido a tan solo el 0,03% del total de emisiones de CO2 del mundo. Mozambique es uno de los muchos territorios de sacrificio. El país ha experimentado eventos climáticos extremos cada vez más devastadores y con mayor frecuencia, como inundaciones, sequías y ciclones que dejan cada año cientos de miles de personas en necesidad de asistencia humanitaria. Mozambique fue declarado el país más vulnerable al clima en 2021 y el séptimo país con mayor riesgo de desastres ambientales en 2022. La genealogía del extractivismo en Mozambique no es sorpresa, se remonta al periodo colonial portugués y al interés por el acceso y el control de sus recursos naturales, así como a la explotación de la mano de obra local. La extracción del carbón fue imprescindible para el proyecto colonizador de Mozambique. La primera concesión de extracción de gas fósil de ultramar se concedió en el año 2000. Entre 2010 y 2013 se encontraron nuevas reservas de gas en Mozambique, convirtiendo el país en lo que ahora se considera la novena mayor reserva de gas fósil del mundo. No muy lejos de Nacala, donde me encuentro, todavía más al norte de Mozambique, se encuentra la provincia de Cabo Delgado, una de las más empobrecidas del país. Aquí se encuentran también la primera planta de gas fósil flotante de África y los 3 proyectos de gas fósil licuado más grandes de todo el continente africano. La extracción y el licuado de gas fósil en Cabo Delgado ha provocado graves impactos ecológicos, daño significativo en importantes ecosistemas, como el que alberga el vecino Parque Natural de las Guirimbas, la emisión de una enorme cantidad de gases de efecto invernadero, se calcula que hasta 49 veces más de lo que normalmente Mozambique emite cada año. También ha provocado la vulneración de derechos humanos a la población local, que fue desplazada forzosamente sin ser debidamente consultada o compensada. Además, también ha provocado inestabilidad política y militarización de la zona. Desde el 2021, también en Cabo Delgado, comenzó un sangriento conflicto en las inmediaciones de las zonas extractivas, que desde entonces sigue causando el desplazamiento, asesinato, secuestro de cientos de miles de personas. La planta de gas licuado de Cabo Delgado es mayoritariamente propiedad de corporaciones transnacionales, como la italiana Eni y la francesa Total Energies. Detuvieron sus operaciones en Cabo Delgado con el comienzo del conflicto en 2021 al ser acusadas de violaciones de derechos humanos. Y Total Energies ahora amenaza con no retomar operaciones hasta que se construya una zona militar fortificada en Cabo Delgado, en la península de Afungi, a la que no se permitirá acceso a la población local y será solamente abastecida por personal, por mar o aire. Es decir, de nuevo, otro ejemplo más de militarización del territorio a costa de la población local. Las mujeres internamente desplazadas, como consecuencia de la escalada de violencia en Cabo Delgado, no han sido solamente víctimas en sus cuerpos y en sus territorios, también se han organizado con micropolíticas de paz y mantenimiento de la vida. En los campos de refugiados, por ejemplo, cerca de donde me encuentro en Nacala, practican prácticas solidarias de apoyo mutuo y construcción de paz, como donaciones de comida, trabajo comunitario, cuidados de la infancia y personas mayores o pequeños préstamos que posibilitan la supervivencia de las poblaciones de la comunidad que se encuentran en una situación de mayor vulnerabilidad. Voy a ir terminando solamente en 30 segundos. Voy a cambiar otra vez a inglés. We need the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we need it to equally address the impacts of fossil fuel production on global peace and security. It needs to incorporate mechanisms to halt fossil fuels to contribute to human rights violations and fuel militarized violence, and mechanisms to repair what has been destroyed, from bodies to territories to systems of care and responsibility. Only by recognizing the treaty as simultaneously a tool for peace will it really contribute to a just and equitable transition. Furthermore, it should not stop in fossil fuel production, but expand to the interlinkages of other forms of extractivism and exploitation of bodies, territories, and care systems also embedded in renewable energy. We must demand energy embargoes for fossil fuel supplies from conflict-affected territories like Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, as well as fossil fuel supplies to military occupations such as Gaza and West Bank by the genocidal state of Israel. Those who have contributed to the climate crisis are also those who are bombing the planet. We need to ask ourselves, what do we need energy for? Is it energy for peace or to destroy life? We need to protect life, and we need a fossil fuel that protects life. And we need to invest in that sustains life and not in that destroys life. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Thank you so much, dear Beatrice, for this really powerful intervention. Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, but yeah, thank you also for sharing the really vivid description of how the realities and the lived realities of communities in Mozambique have changed from, self-sufficiency to sites of pollution and militarization that is ongoing. And yeah, thank you also so much for reminding us about supporting energy embargoes of exports and imports. That's a really important point. Thank you so much. I will leave it here for now and move on to Ayshka. I will spotlight you. Here we go. Hello. Ayshka Najib is a climate justice activist and intersectional feminist working with the People's Climate Diplomacy Program as the campaign coordinator and just transition lead. She also leads global policy work on a gender just transition with the Women and Gender constituency. She is one of the Fossil Fuel Treaty youth champions. Ayshka, you are based in the Middle East and you have a really unique perspective on how the intersections of militarism and climate injustice play out in this region. And you're also an expert on the just transition, and you speak a lot about the risks of replicating the same systems of oppression and extraction in the renewable energy transition. So it would be really helpful to understand a bit more about the risks of green colonialism, specifically in the region. And then also, you are co-authoring a report together with WILPF Germany that connects and looks at feminist foreign policies with climate justice perspectives. And it looks at, what a truly feminist just transition looks like. So if you could also speak a little bit to that, that would be really great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It really is an honor to be a part of this conversation and to share a little bit about what's happening in the region and also the research that I've been able to co-author with WILPF Germany and the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And coming from a feminist and intersectional lens, I believe the beauty of feminism is that we get to challenge the binaries. And that's exactly what I've been doing through my own research over the just transition and the fossil fuel industry as well, is to really challenge the binary of the energy system specifically and to not see energy as neutral or energy as good or bad, but energy as a nuance that encapsulates so many layers of systemic barriers and also systemic extractivism, exploitation, and so on. And that really, challenged me to ask the question, especially around energy security that we're seeing taking up space in global policies, to really ask whether when we talk about energy security, whose security do we actually mean? And at whose cost are we talking about this energy security? In the MENA region specifically, fossil fuels have never been only about energy because it has always been an instrument of power, war, and control. And we know that fossil fuels finance and fuels conflicts, and an estimate of 25 to 50% of interstate wars since 1973 have been linked to the oil, and military itself is amongst the largest fossil fuel consumers. If we are to take the case of Palestine specifically, it really goes to show how energy is never a neutral system because energy, yes, it can sustain life, but at the same time, it is also something that can be weaponized. In Palestine, we see this brutality, right? We know that around 2.1 million people in Gaza are denied the access to power, meaning that especially social sectors such as hospital and also water systems cannot function. And energy is being used as a weapon of war to uphold this illegal occupation, genocide, and apartheid. So security narratives are being used to justify this, while fossil fuel companies and complicit governments are signing deals to extract natural gas and oil and coal from Palestinian lands. And we know that it is also the same oil and gas that is fueling the fighter jets and the illegal settlements. So this is just to really, show that just transition is also not in the aspects of good energy or bad energy, but that that just transition cannot happen when people live under siege, conflict, occupation, and militarization. Um, in the MENA region in specific, we are seeing just transition happen, but is it truly just is a question. In the region of Tunisia, there is a place called Burj Salih. It is a coastal region, and there was a wind power plant that was built in the region back in 2011 by an energy company in Tunisia. However, this wind power plant was not consulted by any of the community members or any of the people that lived in that community. And according to the International Energy Agency on how wind power plants needs to be built that allows for the public in the community to live in peace in terms of the sound pollution and also access to their own land and territories for their livelihoods. This wind power plant violates all of those laws. Moreover, there has been several farmers in the region who have lost their livelihood due to their animals not being able to graze those lands where the wind turbines are being have been installed. We can also see that these wind turbines does not allow the community to access their own energy needs. And there are several researchers that has shown where the communities have said that not only did they violate their free, prior, and informed consent, but their own households live in darkness. And this is just an this is just an international company that is also profiting out of the resources in the lands of the people. And we're seeing that with the green hydrogen projects as well. Especially the European Union, so countries in the European Union's energy transition is mainly focused on green hydrogen. And we are seeing that there's been several deals signed on green hydrogen projects in the MENA region, especially also in the example of Tunisia. But none of these deals include how, number one, the communities that is going to be living in this region are going to be consulted, because it's going to have immense impacts, especially on the fisher folks. And secondly, we know that Tunisia right now is under extreme water scarcity as climate change is being hit the hardest in our region. And we also know that the energy that is going to be produced from these green hydrogen power plants are going to go directly into global norths, and it is not serving the energy needs of the country in itself and the people in itself, which violates the energy sovereignty of the global south countries, and especially in this case, Tunisia. So this is basically a form of green colonialism where the global south resources are being exploited and extracted to serve the needs of global north. It is just, the remix of the same systems of oppression. And what we're trying to really show through the research is also that swapping the fossil fuels for renewables, but if we keep the same imperial logic of land grabs and exploitation, then it is not really just transition. With the research, we have been trying to combine the three pillars of the Fossil Fuel Treaty, which is a global just transition, proliferation from oil, coal, and gas, and a fair phase out, with the pillars of a feminist foreign policy that has been outlined by WILPF, which are number one, active peace commitment, intersectionality, accountability, empathetic reflectivity, and substantive representation and participation. And through that combination of the three pillars of the treaty and the principles outlined by a feminist foreign policy, we were able to come across a few questions that really defines what a just transition should be addressed from. Firstly, energy for whom? And this really explores the reality of who benefits from the renewable energy production and distribution. So we know that energy access is deeply unequal, and this can be viewed from two sides, right? Firstly, the lack of access to sustainable energy by poorer and marginalized communities within countries. And secondly, the energy poverty faced by global south countries struggling to use their own resources of energy sovereignty while deepening on neocolonial models of extraction and supply of resources and energy back to wealthier nations in the global north. And secondly, it is energy by whom? And this examines who controls, produces, and profits from the energy. This we can see in the case of the wind turbines in Tunisia. And whether the energy system are set up in a centralized and privatized models, or is it in a decentralized and community-led models that actually serves the needs of the people? And third is energy for what? This examines the purpose of the energy use, right? And whose needs are prioritized in the energy system. So there is a stark difference in building regenerative models of energy that serves a social and ecological well-being of the people, and the planet and extractive models of energy that serves exploitative industries. And last but not the least is how is the energy being made? So this explores the ethics, sustainability, and justice of energy production. We know that large-scale energy projects does not take into consideration free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples and local communities on whose lands the resources for the energy production is being extracted, or where big power plants are being built, whilst they lead to displacement, violence, and forced labor of the frontline communities. And we also have research that shows us when renewable energy power plants are being built in global south land. Number one, it is colonial, because when we think about it specifically, a lot of the lands and territories in our countries in the global south, and especially in the region, are seen as empty lands by the colonizing global north countries. And they see, and this is just a direct dehumanization of our people, and also a complete disregard and disrespect to our territories and the ancestral and cultural heritage it holds, by seeing it as empty spaces that can be exploited and extracted by the global north countries. And we see that when the global north countries come to build their power plants, they bring the military with them. And it is resulting in direct violence, especially also gender-based violence by the frontline communities and the indigenous people's bodies in those territories. And we're also seeing lots of issues of child labor and forced labor, especially also in the case of critical mining industries. And also in the conversation of critical minerals in general, which is being necessary for the just transition. First, the question is, who defines if the mineral is critical or not, right? Which are the countries that are benefiting from the so-called critical minerals? There's also a recent data that was shown that the critical minerals that has been extracted is enough for the just transition, and there is no need for increased mining of the critical minerals. And this is just a cycle that has been perpetuated to increase profits of the military industrial complex. And we know that this mining booms is what is reproducing violent extractivism, land conflicts, displacement, a militarized security around these mines, especially in our countries. So the minerals also feed the military-industrial complex, which reinforces the same fossil-fueled militarism that we had claimed to leave behind in the quest for a just transition. So we can't really spin the same wheels of extractivism, exploitation, and capitalism and call it a just transition. That is simply not how it works. And when we talk about a feminist analysis of international cooperation over energy and just transition in general, we are questioning ourselves on who defines security, whose voices are shaping this transition, and how do we address colonial legacies and historic responsibility. So our policy brief argues that a just transition must be centered with people in the quest of justice, equity, and also built on decolonial and demilitarized principles. We also call for ensuring intersectionality, which is really acknowledging how gender, race, and class shape the climate impacts. And also accountability and reparations, that the global north, number one, must finance and support transitions without creating new dependencies. And the decolonial justice, right? So respecting indigenous sovereignty and energy democracy. We know that true security comes from decentralized, democratic, affordable energy systems that safeguard both people and ecosystem, and not from militarized forms of energy security. And another issue that when we talk about neocolonialism, especially in the energy sector, what we often don't talk about is the different ways that the global north is reinforcing its dependencies, the global south's dependencies on itself. And one of that example is, guess who the minerals critical, who deems what an energy security is, whose resources are being extracted, but also something that we don't talk about is technologies and who has access to those technologies. It is in many of the global north countries where technologies that are needed for the so-called just transition are being patented or licensed under intellectual property rights, which causes global south countries to pay millions, if not billions, to access those technologies that is needed for transitioning and for their own energy sovereignty, again, linking those dependencies. So we can see, for example, in the case of vaccines, right? So back when the pandemic happened, the vaccines were patented by global north countries, leading to many global south countries having to are needing to take loans from the international banks to access those vaccines. And we're seeing the same patterns being repeated through the renewable energy technologies that is needed as well. And it really is to show that there are these different layers of neocolonialism that is being integrated into the energy transition, from exploitation of resources to the linking of technologies and finances in the hands of global north countries. And another important thing that really needs to be addressed is we talk about greening the economy, moving away from the fossil fuels and transitioning into a green economy. But what we don't ask ourselves is which economy are we talking about greening? Because if we cannot talk or we cannot green an economy that is fueling genocides, that exploits care labor and relies on infinite growth and infinite extraction and exploitation of resources. This economy simply cannot be greened. And that's why we need, as feminists, to also think about alternate economic models, especially bringing in principles of degrowth, bringing in principles of planetary boundaries, and bringing in principles of dignified living of the people, especially marginalized peoples, and also the recognition of gendered labor, especially the care economic sector. And that's why a feminist just transition demands transforming the very systems of power, economic, colonial, patriarchal, all of this that created the crisis in the first place. We know that energy justice means dismantling the same systems that made fossil fuels a weapon of war. And I just want to conclude by saying that when we think about revolution, we cannot lead a revolution in comfort, which means that truly recognizing the systems of oppression, systems of extraction, exploitation, and capitalism is going to require sitting in discomfort. And that's what the feminist analysis of in military analysis of fossil fuels and just transition is asking us to do, is to ask these uncomfortable questions and not just see things in binary, good and bad energy, fossil fuels and renewables, but to rather ask what is unmasked and what is underneath all of these systems. And that really brings out, the center of it all, that what we're fighting for is for people and planet, and to make sure that everyone can live in dignity, which includes people in the global south, which includes our lands and our territories, to be seen as a whole and to be seen as equal, and not just lands that can be exploited to benefit the few. But I've taken too much time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ayshka. I was taking so many notes and want to address so many things that you mentioned, but I just really appreciate all of the questions really that you're, putting to all of us, and to us working in this space. Energy for who, what are critical minerals, and also really questioning the binaries that you mentioned. It's not just it's not just renewable energy good and fossil fuels bad, but it's much more complex than that. And I think something that at least I haven't seen being talked about as much is the issue of renewable energy installations in the global south and the colonial dynamics happening there. I've read it a lot now when it comes to the critical minerals issue, but I feel like the renewable energy installations and how that replicates colonial dynamics and extraction is really something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to as well. So thank you so much. I mean, there's so much more, um, but I will get back to my notes. Thank you, Ayshka. Okay, let's move on to Natalia. Natalia, I will spotlight you, and you can start sharing your screen whilst I introduce you. Natalia Monroy Chavez is a feminist woman with experience in coordinating international cooperation projects that promote women's political participation in peace building and development sectors. She has been working to highlight the links between feminist economics, feminist political ecology, and anti-militarism approach with the women, peace, and security agenda from the Global South. Natalia is currently the Women, Peace, and Security Program Coordinator of WILPF, Colombia. Natalia, you have co-authored an extensive report that explores the impacts of the fossil fuel industry in Colombia from an ecofeminist, intersectional, and decolonial perspective. And you've done this, amongst others, by bringing together the feelings, reflections, and testimonies of women leaders and advocates from the departments of Bolívar, Meta, and Guavira. So, women directly impacted by extraction and Colombia's history of socio-environmental conflicts. So, I would love to hear more from you about the main findings of your research and also based on all of the research that you've done and specifically the interviews and conversations with women land defenders, what your recommendations are for a just transition that is truly gender responsive.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Catherine. ¿Se escucha? ¿Se escucha bien? Estupendo. Bueno, voy a intentar contar todo esto que hemos venido haciendo desde el Impal Colombia, que son muchos elementos a tener en cuenta en este tiempo que tenemos. Agradecer también este espacio que me parece muy interesante tener, digamos, esta posibilidad de intercambio de perspectivas, muchas similaridades con lo que ha dicho Beatriz, con lo que ha dicho la compañera Ayshka. Pareciera que las lógicas de estos sistemas de opresión operan claramente de una manera muy similar en todos los territorios y en todos los continentes. Gracias también a mis compañeras panelistas por el espacio y gracias también por asistir. Vengo aquí a compañeros y a compañeras del grupo de Latinoamérica y el Caribe del Tratado. Así que una maravilla poder tener esta oportunidad para compartir estas reflexiones y estas recomendaciones también que hemos venido haciendo desde Colombia. Me voy a permitir entonces compartir pantalla. Tengo una presentación sobre la cual quisiera em, pues tener como referencia para lo que les voy a contar. La presentación está en español, pero con gusto la podemos pasar también a inglés para poder compartirlas con todos los asistentes y las asistentes al webinar. Y me voy a permitir también hablar en español, justamente por poder tener una audiencia, que sé que la audiencia es global, pero reivindicar también este idioma como un idioma donde nos podemos, que podemos también establecer este tipo de diálogos y este tipo de articulaciones. Desde el Impal Colombia, desde hace aproximadamente un par de años, 2023-2024, hemos venido trabajando en hacer una suerte de vínculos entre la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad y otras agendas donde veíamos que cada vez más había que establecer un diálogo muchísimo más articulado, muchísimo más consistente y más potente en lo que significaba la seguridad de los territorios, en los territorios, la seguridad para las comunidades, pero particularmente un ejercicio de reconceptualización de lo que significa la seguridad para las mujeres, más allá de lo que el Estado ofertaba como seguridad en términos de presencia de actores armados en el territorio, le hace fuerza pública y lo que implica esto para en el aumento de las violencias contra las mujeres en los territorios. Particularmente en Colombia, en un contexto claramente influenciado y pues impactado también por 60 años, al menos 60 años de conflicto armado en los territorios, em, donde ha habido un aumento, un incremento desproporcionado, bueno, desproporcionado, esa no es una buena, no es una buena alusión, pero donde ha habido un incremento increíble de asesinatos contra líderes y lideresas territoriales y donde había un aumento también de riesgos y amenazas contra líderes y lideresas ambientales. Colombia, según un informe de la Global Witness, es el país más peligroso para ejercer el derecho a la defensa ambiental y a la defensa territorial. Pero también en el contexto de Colombia ha habido una reconfiguración del conflicto armado, incluso después de la firma del acuerdo final de paz con la exguerrilla de las FARC. Y el contexto es muy dinámico y hay que estar entendiendo y que estar leyendo continuamente lo que está sucediendo en un país como este para tener algunas claridades específicas de qué es lo que está sucediendo, qué actores armados, legales e ilegales están en el territorio, qué está implicando para el ejercicio de defensa de derechos humanos y de derechos económicos, sociales, culturales, ambientales en los territorios y qué propuestas se está generando desde el movimiento social, pero particularmente desde el movimiento de mujeres y feministas para la gobernanza territorial, para para posicionar sus ejercicios de resistencia. Y de ahí sale entonces esta posibilidad de investiguemos y desarrollemos y generemos evidencia de cómo efectivamente se vinculan todas estas agendas, la agenda ambiental, la agenda de seguridad, y cómo claramente se puede ir haciendo una nueva o ir posicionando un nuevo paradigma de seguridad en relación con el cuidado y en relación con la defensa del territorio en Colombia. Entonces ahí empezamos a identificar elementos de la crisis climática, elementos de la crisis que no es solo climática, sino socioecológica, elementos, por supuesto, de los mismos impactos en términos del incremento de violencias contra las mujeres en el marco del conflicto armado, pero también violencias contra las mujeres en el ámbito o en la esfera pública y en la esfera privada, y esto cómo dialoga con la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad. Y claramente también recoger elementos de cómo ha sido el impacto de la profundización del modelo extractivista en Colombia, que básicamente pues ha sido un modelo que se ha profundizado y que con ello se, digamos, ha traído también unos impactos y unos efectos en términos incluso de vulneración, por supuesto, de derechos humanos, pero también de vulneración de derecho a la vida y de vulneración de derecho a la paz en un territorio y en un país como este. Nosotras hicimos esta investigación, claramente como decías, Catrín, en clave de generar evidencia, pero también con la intencionalidad de poder posicionar las voces y las experiencias y las trayectorias de las mujeres defensoras en 5 departamentos en Colombia, 5 departamentos que hemos identificado y que hemos priorizado en primera medida porque Limpal ha venido teniendo un trabajo de fortalecimiento de liderazgos de las mujeres en estos departamentos desde una perspectiva de feminismo antimilitarista, que es, digamos, como la apuesta diferenciadora que desde Limpal venimos aportando en diferentes espacios de incidencia, en diferentes espacios de exigibilidad. Y la iniciativa del trabajo del tratado no es, pues es un espacio en el que también hemos venido intercambiando estas reflexiones. Estos departamentos también son departamentos o territorios donde ha habido una fuerte, digamos, profundización de este modelo extractivista y donde vemos con mayor evidencia los efectos que ese modelo tiene y cómo está relacionado con la estigmatización y criminalización de la defensa del territorio y particularmente de las mujeres lideresas y defensoras que además por el hecho de ser mujer tienen unos riesgos y unas amenazas específicas en este proceso de ejercicio de resistencia y de defensa territorial. Entonces, por ejemplo, en Guaviare y en Caquetá nos encontramos con un aumento de la deforestación que está muy ligada con la expansión de la frontera agrícola, el aumento de la ganadería extensiva. Lo ponemos también aquí a colación porque no solo se trata el modelo extractivista en relación con la extracción de combustibles fósiles, sino que eso también dialoga y opera de manera similar con otros sectores también que tienen que ver con esta apuesta por el modelo extractivista. Por eso nos interesaba también tener esas reflexiones y esas experiencias desde la defensa territorial con otros sectores que dialogaba claramente con los impactos del extractivismo desde los minerales fósiles. Cauca, por ejemplo, es un departamento, un territorio que ha cargado con el mayor número de asesinatos de líderes y defensoras ambientales y territoriales, la mayoría de ellos comunidades indígenas que han liderado un ejercicio de resistencia y de reconstrucción de sus planes de vida en el marco del conflicto armado y posacuerdo. Meta es un territorio estratégico para la extracción de hidrocarburos, también especialmente petróleo. Bolívar ha habido una confluencia entre minería y conflicto armado, megaproyectos relacionados con proyectos a gran escala como el canal del dique, por donde transitan también o donde eventualmente van a transitar todas estas exportaciones de combustibles fósiles, así como la llegada de la agroindustria. En ese sentido, entonces, creemos que existen o identificamos tres elementos claves en nuestro análisis que tiene que ver con extractivismo, patriarcado y racismo ambiental. Desde una lectura también muy crítica y muy desde el sur global y decolonial, donde el modelo extractivista es un patrón de acumulación colonial que implica y que pone a la naturaleza en un lugar de recurso, ¿sí? Al servicio de intereses económicos. Entonces es una relación claramente, digamos, colonial en relación con la naturaleza como un recurso para un sector y para unas ganancias y unos incrementos de ganancias también de unos intereses privados, generalmente transnacionales. Y esto está ligado también con un pensamiento patriarcal de cómo concebimos las dinámicas de la dominación de dominación del extractivismo. Entonces ahí los cuerpos femeninos, los cuerpos feminizados se establecen como unos sujetos de subordinación al mismo tiempo que la naturaleza y el territorio se establecen y son considerados también como sujetos de dominación. Y ahí es donde la lógica o el pensamiento antropocéntrico y androcéntrico se materializa, digamos, en este diálogo y en esta profundización del modelo militarizado, del modelo extractivista y de la estigmatización del ejercicio de defensa de derechos, de defensa de derechos en su amplio, digamos, espectro, individuales y colectivos, es donde creemos que se materializa esta relación antropocéntrica y androcéntrica. Por lo tanto, históricamente, la materialización de esta apuesta económica y de esta apuesta de este modelo, pues es claramente masculinizada, son economías masculinizadas, donde la participación de las mujeres en la gobernanza territorial y en los mecanismos de gobernanza y espacios de incidencia y de exigibilidad es mínima, y cuando están presentes, pues se exponen en términos de seguridad, y eso implica que continuamente tengan que estar subiendo y bajando el perfil de participación en los diferentes espacios. Y estas economías masculinizadas pues perpetúan las desigualdades en términos de género, en términos de clase, en términos de raza y en general en términos de todos estos sistemas de dominación y de opresión que desde el feminismo interseccional pues hemos venido visibilizando y reivindicando en términos de transformación. Y esas economías masculinizadas pues redundan y profundizan los conflictos socioambientales, y Colombia no es ajeno, digamos, a ese proceso. Em, Voy a referirme a unos tipos específicos de afectaciones, pero voy a pasar por algunos muy por encima para poder profundizar un poquito más desde la perspectiva del feminismo antimilitarista y lo que hemos identificado en términos de la relación del sistema militarista y el sistema extractivista, porque las otras afectaciones que hemos identificado también hemos bebido de la trayectoria y de las luchas y las experiencias que las organizaciones ambientales han tenido aquí en Colombia. Por lo tanto, no queremos como profundizar tanto, y digamos, en esas repercusiones que son muy importantes y que nos permiten identificar esos factores de diálogo, esos elementos de diálogo, sino más en lo que cómo aportamos desde esta apuesta de la desmilitarización de los territorios y del ejercicio de defensa y de protección de los liderazgos de las mujeres en estos procesos de resistencia. Entonces, se identifican en la investigación impactos ambientales del modelo extractivista, el cambio en la vocación del suelo y de ordenamiento del territorio, que cuáles son las economías locales en términos también desde la perspectiva de autonomía económica de las mujeres que ellas han venido reivindicando, hacen un ejercicio de resistencia y de defensa territorial, pero también contribuyen a desarrollar propuestas de gobernanza territorial muy interesantes que eventualmente no se escuchan y no se tienen en cuenta en los espacios de participación. Sus apuestas en términos de soberanía alimentaria. Ya no solo hablamos de seguridad alimentaria, hablamos de soberanía alimentaria que implica, digamos, una visión muchísimo más amplia y, en mi opinión, muchísimo más exigible en términos de las tomas de decisiones de la gobernanza territorial de las mujeres. Hablamos de impactos en términos de salud, sobre todo de los derechos sexuales y reproductivos de las mujeres, de los impactos en términos de la ruptura del tejido social comunitario y de los procesos organizativos. También, y esto es un elemento que ha sido muy importante en términos de cómo se va posicionando cada vez más en las agendas de protección y de seguridad de las mujeres, y es cuando hablamos de espiritualidad y el legado biocultural comunitario. Ojo, sin naturalizar el rol, digamos, por ejemplo, que han tenido las mujeres em, sabedoras y sanadoras ancestrales, ¿no? Que tienen muchos aprendizajes y de donde podemos aprender, muchos aprendizajes, no, tienen muchas experiencias de donde podemos aprender, pero sin que esa apuesta se naturalice claramente en los sujetos mujeres, así como tampoco se debería naturalizar los roles de cuidado de las mujeres. Me pareció muy interesante la intervención de la compañera Ayshka en ese sentido, porque nosotras también vemos vínculos en la agenda de mujeres, paz y seguridad, la crisis socioecológica y la agenda de cuidados. Y
Mm.
ahí podemos incluso podemos profundizar sobre ello más adelante. Y por supuesto, impactos en la seguridad y militarización de los territorios. Y me voy a ir a esto en específico, digamos, a este elemento particular que es desde donde hemos venido profundizando más el aporte.
Natalia,
La militariz-
querida, disculpa, can you finish, wrap up in the next minute? Sorry, we're running out of time.
Dos
Sorry.
minutos y cierro,
Vale,
sí.
vale.
Gracias. Sí, la militarización de los territorios en Colombia siempre ha venido, digamos, muy en relación de la protección y la securitización de las áreas geográficas estratégicas de los desarrollos. Cuando un área se nombra como estratégica, ahí se profundizan los conflictos socioambientales. Eh, y además esto genera y aumenta en un continuum de violencia y exclusión socioeconómica de las mujeres, justamente por esta narrativa de que la presencia de la fuerza pública genera protección y seguridad en los territorios y nosotras hemos evidenciado que no necesariamente ha sido de esta manera. No solo no ha sido de esta manera, sino que además se desarrolla un ejercicio de criminalización y de estigmatización de las mujeres lideresas y defensoras como enemigas de desarrollo. Eso es un link entre este milipatriarcado y el extractivismo. El otro link que vemos es que la industria militar tiene unos impactos amplísimos en términos de daños ambientales, de gases de efecto invernadero, de restos tóxicos de la guerra, de impactos militares también en el ecosistema. Y hay muchos ejemplos aquí en Colombia que tiene que ver con ello. Y quería hacer como una alusión específica al ejemplo del Comando Sur, que además eso tiene también unos intereses geopolíticos en la región. Y es como el Comando Sur ha venido, digamos, haciendo intervenciones en Latinoamérica, muy en clave de lo que comentaba también la compañera de hacer una apropiación de los minerales críticos. ¿Qué significa esto de los minerales críticos también
Mm,
para Colombia y
vale.
para las defensoras? Y ya finalmente, y con esto cierro, pues yo creemos desde Colombia que hay que problematizar pues esta apuesta por la militarización de los territorios en clave de una estrategia de que está implicando el rol de la fuerza pública y de las fuerzas militares en la protección de un
Mm,
modelo extractivista y en la estigmatización
mm,
de las mujeres y cómo el tratado se configura como una herramienta pública de exigibilidad que vincula todas estas agendas y
mm,
que de alguna manera permite reivindicar que la transición justa y las transiciones energéticas sin justicia de género y sin participación de las mujeres en esos procesos no es completa, no es total. Y con
sí.
esto dejo para poder continuar el debate en el siguiente espacio.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for your contribution. And I think what's been really valuable is to hear your profoundly ecofeminist analysis of what's going on in Colombia and to really spotlight and uplift the experiences and perspectives of those directly impacted by extractivism and the long-term conflict in Colombia. And thank you also for some of the suggestions of how the fossil fuel treaty can bring all of these struggles or address all of these struggles. And yeah, lots of food for thought there as well. And we're running a little bit out of time, so I will move on to our next panelist and final panelist, Mitzi. I'm just going to spotlight you if I manage. Here, okay. Mitzi, let me briefly introduce you. You are a full-time climate justice activist and organizer from Metro Manila, Philippines. Mitzi is a global coordinator with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative and the international spokesperson for Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines. She's also one of the co-founders of Fridays for Future MAPA. And Mitzi is a really strong voice on anti-imperialism, decolonization, and the intersectionality of the climate crisis. Um, so, Mitzi, as I just mentioned in your introduction, you are a climate justice activist from the Philippines, and you have direct experience of the intersecting crises of militarism, the climate crisis, and extractivism. But you also work at the global level. You connect with activists all over the world, and you engage with UN processes such as the UN Climate Conference. So you have both kind of the localized experience and perspective, but also a global kind of bird's eye perspective on how these local struggles and experiences are part and parcel of global systems of colonialism, patriarchy, and extractivism. And so it would be really great to hear more about these intersections and analysis from your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you so much to Beatrice, Ayshka, and Natalia so far for the very comprehensive understanding of the connections of militarization, fossil fuels, feminism. And I'm always so grateful to be in spaces like these because we start to really weave in a global narrative and understanding of how connected it is, especially when you start hearing what's happening, at least for me from Natalia and Ayshka, when they were talking, I was like, this is also something that I hear in the Philippines. This is also something that I'm experiencing and witnessing in the Philippines. And you really start to see how militarization, the fossil fuel industry, the systems that we have in general, are almost copy pasting and replicating a lot of their models in different ways. And so you really start to see the fractal of the system almost, where like on the global scale, this is what it looks like. And then when you shrink down to national, when you zoom into local, into regional, and like you zoom in more and more, you see the similar patterns of exploitation. And at the same time, you also see that at every level there is resistance. At every level, there are solutions, often led by women and marginalized genders. And so, yes, I want to start with the Philippines and how, similar to Colombia, we're one of the countries that's most dangerous for environmental defenders and activists. A lot of our indigenous peoples, our small farmers, our small fisher folk, and are the ones that are being targeted. And most of them are being targeted by our own military, by the Philippine government's military. Um, to give a better understanding of what it's like in the Philippines, the farmers and the fisher folk and the indigenous peoples that the military is targeting, they're targeting them because they're protesting, because they're going up against large-scale multinational corporations, whether that's for indigenous peoples, that's large-scale mining corporations for either critical minerals, which Ayshka was talking about, which are being used for the transition into renewable energy, or for renewable energy, like hydro dams, actually, etc. For our small farmers, it's against land grabbing by large landlords. And in the Philippines, we still have a landlord serf system in the same way that you would imagine medieval Europe, for example, for the ones listening here who might not be familiar. We have landlords who still own large plots of land and farmers who do not own their own land being hired or renting that land and being really exploited in that sense. And so even though the Philippines is an agricultural country and an archipelagic country, you would think that our farmers and fisher folk are some of the most, successful and um, the most like who are able to access a lot of those resources, yet actually they are some of the most marginalized sectors economically because of the exploitation that's happening to them. And so when small farmers are going up against these large scale agricultural systems where they want to put monocrop plantations because that's what's profitable, they get targeted by the military as well. And then with fisher folk, it's a mix, and farmers as well, it's a mix also of the coal power plants that are nearby in their areas, or again, large scale multinational corporations. And so if you see the common thread in all three of them is that exploitative system that prioritizes profit over anything else. And why we want to focus on the fossil fuel industry exactly is because the fossil fuel industry is what fuels this extractivist, patriarchal, imperialist system. And when I mean by fuel, it means literally giving the energy for all this crops now to be transported. It's also what's, driving them to create these things, but also fueling in the sense that it gives it profit. So the fossil fuel industry is really at the core of the imperialist, patriarchal, extractivist system. But as Ayshka was already mentioning earlier, we cannot stop at the fossil fuel industry because we can still replicate the same extractivist system that will prioritize profit at all costs. And that's what leads to war and violence, right? And so that's why we bring in that feminist aspect, ensuring that it's not just a green energy transition, but one that's based on justice, one that's based on care, one that's based on coalition building, one that's based on community building. If we look at it and really start to understand the systems that we're in, the systems that we have that prioritize profit, they have created an other. And this other is either women, when it's next to men, it's people of color, it's the working class, it's disabled bodies, it's nature. And this other can now be exploited in any way that it can, as long as it profits the ones who are allowed to profit. And it's about your proximity to who is profiting and your proximity to the other. And they can change that at any moment in time, right? If we look historically, in the US when there was still, I mean, there's still modern day slavery today, but in the US when we had like the peak of slavery, at one point, Irish people were classified alongside Black and brown people. And then the slave owners and the ones profiting and the ruling class at that time realized, oh, they're starting to unite together. We now have to create an othering system within them that one of them who is more like us gets more benefits, gets more privileges than the others, and then that makes them weaker. And so that there is where feminism comes into play, because in feminism, the way I see feminism, at least, it's about community care. It's about collective care. It's about seeing each other and like creating coalitions together. Because where I've seen the most reciprocity, where I've seen the most care are from the women farmers and the women fisherfolk and the women indigenous peoples. This is where the solutions lie because, when there's an extreme weather event in the Philippines, we have a lot of typhoons, we have a lot of typhoons and droughts. And supposedly the military is there in their communities to help them during these disasters, but they leave. It is the women who are the community leaders because they know the children, they know the families, because they are the ones who are at home building that home. And I don't know how to explain it in the sense that I feel like one great thing that feminism globally has been able to do is bring women into the workforce, into like factories, into the businesses. But it stopped there. And what we need to do and keep doing is to get men and people socialized as men to also do homework. Is that not homework like for school, but like the labor of building homes, the labor of creating communities, because that is such an important job in society. And when you leave it completely to women, but also expect them to work in the workforce, then they just have a third shift. Like it's not even just a second shift because many women, especially in the global south, have to do many things. And then at home, they still have labor. And so that labor is often the one, I think Ayshka mentioned it, that the invisibilized labor of care work, that it's not important, but actually this is where the solutions lie because they're the ones who know how to make their homes adapt. They're the ones who know what kind of disaster relief and emergency responses we needed because they know the area. And so there's so much solutions lying in that. And then when we zoom out again, going back to the fossil fuel industry, that's why initiatives like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty really has the potential to address this because it's attacking the very fuel, the very source of the fossil fuel industry. And we know that there have been studies that say that renewable energy systems really cannot sustain the level of extraction that the fossil fuel industry and the capitalist system is doing today. And so when we cut off that life source, that bloodline almost of the industry, then we have a really good chance of really addressing the overarching oppressive systems. And the fossil fuel treaty, it's based off of previous peace treaties. It's based off of previous indigenous treaties. And that is how we're recognizing the importance of these treaties. And it's also being very honest that I personally don't think that having a fossil fuel treaty will address all the injustices in the world and will address the militarization in the world, but it's a very good first step because it is attacking one of the things that's fueling it. I believe our previous speakers already mentioned it earlier, but we've seen how wars and occupation and Catherine was showing the statistics earlier where one of the reasons why they're happening is to extract fossil fuels from these areas like in Gaza and Palestine. And so the fossil fuel industry both fuels the war, but is also the reason why the wars and militarization is happening. Because again, it's all about protecting profit. The militarization that's happening is all about ensuring that the people in power remain in power. And so how do we address that? We take off their energy, we take off their life force. And it's similar to why boycotting works really well. It's similar why divesting works really well. And in a way, getting rid of the fossil fuel industry is a very powerful divestment because it's not just finances, but really where they're getting it from. And that's why addressing the production, the source of the fossil fuel industry is so important. But I think something that we need to remember is that in the UN spaces, which are really important to engage in, it's still talking about the supply side, like what's happening later, the production side rather. But we need to go to the source. Like, where is it coming from? How do we stop that? How do we address it? And how do we make sure that it actually goes somewhere? And as we're going, and I'll speed up because I know we're over time, but as we're heading towards COP30, there's a lot of initiatives, especially from the women and gender constituency. Ayshka can talk more about this, that pushes for a just transition and ensures that no one is left behind. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty is a complement to all these processes. And we need to engage in as many as possible because the fossil fuel industry, the capitalist industry, is engaging in all of them and trying to weaken us in all of them. This doesn't mean you have to do every single thing, but it means we have to be in solidarity with each other and we need to team up. We need to conspire together and really figure out how to do this and engage in the protests, especially now from September 18 to 2019, September 18 to 21. There are the Draw the Line protests that are focusing a lot on climate. There are also the Palestinian civil society movement is also calling for a disruption of complicity because on the 21st, the UN set a deadline for Israel to stop its ongoing genocide. And they've missed many deadlines before, and this is yet another deadline, but we really, really, really need to get there. And a really beautiful collaboration that I'm seeing is the call for boycotting Chevron, energy embargoes, because there you clearly see that it's the fossil fuel industry that's fueling this genocide that's happening in Palestine. And so, um, bringing in again that those feminist values of community care and collaboration. We need to learn how to collaborate with each other and see that we're not each other's enemies and understand that the system that we have today is also what allows women's bodies to be used and exploited because women's bodies are then equated to Mother Earth. And the earth is allowed to be exploited, so women's bodies are allowed to be exploited. People of color's bodies are allowed to be exploited. And so to create a feminist just transition is really to ensure that our bodies, both our physical individual bodies, but the bodies of the earth, the bodies of nature, are respected, honored, and seen as people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. And yeah, I'm sorry I had to rush a bit through your contribution. So just to say, we do have until, if people still have time to stay on, we'll use the next 10 minutes to properly close this off. But thank you so much for your contributions and yeah, for speaking first about the immediate experiences in the Philippines. And I think what you said about bringing men in to do the homework, not in doing school homework, but like also taking care of the care labor is such an important piece of the puzzle, I think. And you kind of already, you really helped to move us into the next segment of this session, which by you talking about, the fossil fuel treaty and why you see this treaty as having a lot of potential while also recognizing that it won't be able to address and solve all of the huge issues that we're facing, right? But thank you so much for kind of making that transition because I do want to just take a brief moment to talk about the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And we don't have time to talk about it in depth, but I do want to just really remind ourselves why this proposal is being suggested in the first place. Now that we've talked about, all of the ways that fossil fuels are intersecting and reinforcing and sustaining systems of oppression. Basically, the Fossil Fuel Treaty seeks to address the root cause of all of these issues, which is fossil fuels. And fossil fuels is also the root cause of the climate crisis. And many of you might know this, but it is really shocking that there is actually no international agreement to date, internationally binding agreement, climate agreement, that seeks to regulate the root cause of the climate crisis, which is fossil fuels. So far, the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they only are focused on the reduction of emissions, right? So the treaty really seeks to address this huge gap, and it seeks to do so by firstly stopping all expansion of fossil fuels, by stopping the exploration of fossil fuels, and by creating or supporting international cooperation for a just transition. Um, and that includes scaling the necessary finance. So that's why we're also talking about, public finance that needs to come from the military, from military spending. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there's 17 countries currently that are is officially supporting this process, that is seeking a negotiating mandate for the fossil fuel treaty. And this September, Colombia announced that they will host the first intergovernmental conference, um, which will take place next year. And that's a really huge milestone. And that's why I said that I feel very motivated and inspired by this process, because it really is gaining momentum. Um, and as Mitzi also mentioned, this process that we're kind of propelling forward right now is really mapped onto or inspired by treaties that disarmament and arms control treaties, such as the Treaty on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Convention on Cluster Munitions, that where the first step of many was to hold an international conference to get the negotiations going. So really exciting moment in this process. And I would like to finish the webinar off by going again around to all of you, and I will only give you only have two sentences to say, and I mean, Missy, you already spoke to this, but maybe you can expand a little bit to just share what your hopes are for the fossil fuel treaty and why you are supporting this initiative. And this time we'll start with Mitzi, and then we'll go back. And yeah, please, only two sentences, and then we'll close. Thank you.
What I really love about the treaty is it started from the movement and from the global south. The first civil society came from it first came from civil society, and then it came from the Pacific countries and then Colombia. And I think that in itself is a radical shift in where leadership comes from. And that's why I believe in it, because anyone can be part of it, schools, individuals, organizations, and then that will directly translate into having a collaboration with the governments as they talk about the treaty. And it's very important that civil society comes on now, especially, and really supports the treaty, because we want to make sure that as the governments are negotiating it, it doesn't get too watered down. We don't lose the red lines that we need to keep in order to ensure that the values stay as it is now. So please endorse the fossil fuel treaty if you haven't yet.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. Over next to Natalia.
Gracias. Bueno, lo primero es que venga del sur global, este liderazgo nos pone también en una apuesta geopolítica bien interesante. Y yo creo que eso la iniciativa del tratado tiene que aprovecharlo. Para nosotras el tratado es una herramienta fundamental para poder tener esta conexión de agendas ambientales, de construcción de paz y de género. No solo hablamos de justicia climática. Hablamos también de cuidado de la diversidad y de la agenda de cuidados, y hay muchos elementos que nos pueden ayudar a eso. Y en tercero, pues que desde las perspectivas de qué es esto, de qué implica la transición justa para las mujeres o desde una perspectiva feminista, no implica solo una transición o un recambio de modelo o de matriz energética, sino que implica una transformación cultural en la forma como nos relacionamos como sociedad y en la forma como nos relacionamos con el territorio y los ecosistemas.
Gracias, Natalia. Thank you so much. Over to Ayshka.
I believe that the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty gives me so much hope. If I could imagine it as an emoji, I would think of it as a key emoji because I feel like it has such a potential to unlock so many of the barriers and systems that we've been fighting against. And I feel like it really is going to break the cycle of complicity of silence that we have seen from global world leaders, but the complicity of allowing industries to profit over the people and the planet.
Thank you so much, dear Ayshka. And finally, over to Beatrice.
Thank you so much. What I like from the treaty the most is that it's a grassroots tool built from the ground up and has the potential to work as a tool for peace, bridge the silos, and contribute to working synergies from feminist, intersectional, decolonial, and anti-racist perspectives. And just once again, to emphasize, we need to demand polluters to pay for the harms to our bodies and territories. That means fossil fuel industries, but also banks and financial agencies, the military and the wealthiest. And we need BDS and embargo fossil fuel supplies from and to zones of sacrifice. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for your amazing and rich contributions and analysis. And it's also been already shared in the chat how, yeah, it's been such a nuanced discussion, and at the same time, we've also seen so many parallels, no matter where we are and no matter what our contexts are. Like the same dark forces are operating, but we do have some hope, and we have something that we can all support and work towards, and that is the Fossil Fuel Treaty. So I really encourage all of you that aren't yet involved in the treaty to support it. You can support it. You can endorse it as an individual. Amazingly, the 1 million mark has just been crossed in individuals supporting the treaty. You can also endorse the treaty on behalf of your organization. And I also pasted in the chat ways that you can get involved on different levels at the local, national, or international level in support of the treaty. I also shared some resources in the chat, some of upon which some of the contributions today were based on. And finally, I also want to let you know that WILPF exclusively, I'm sharing with you that WILPF will be launching a global campaign on the International Day for Peace this Sunday, 21st of September, which is called Move the Money, Stop Funding War, Start Funding Peace, which seeks to address many of the issues that we've spoken about today. And if you want to learn more and get involved, you can check out those links. And also, if you're interested in WILPF and want to become a member of WILPF, you can reach out to me. I'll put my email address in the chat again. And last but not least, and someone even already gave a shout out to the interpreters today, and I am doing that as well. Thank you so much to the interpreters, especially for staying on longer. And if you have time to fill out a short survey for them, that would be really helpful. And I think that is all. Thank you so, so much to the amazing panelists for the space that we shared, for the time that we shared. I really appreciate you all so much. And hopefully we can have many more of these conversations and be in touch soon. Thank you all.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, interpreters.
Thank you, interpreters. Sorry if I spoke too fast.
Yes, apologies for that.